The Ottawa Jewish Historical Society presents the annual Ben Karp Memorial Lecture on Wednesday, May the 8th, 2002. Mrs. Sylvia Kershman will speak about Families, Friends, Lowertown, a retrospective.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good evening and welcome to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's opening event of the season, the Ben Karp Memorial Lecture. Tonight, Sylvia Kershman will offer us an in-depth and personal perspective of the close-knit Jewish community of Lowertown of yesteryear. Last summer's successful Lowertown bus tour gave us a brief introduction to the story of a thriving Lowertown Jewish community. Tonight, Sylvia Kershman will expand upon this story and speak about historical and personal aspects of life in that era and that location. Sylvia Kershman was born and raised in Ottawa and attended York Street Public School, Lizard Collegiate, and Willis Business College. She was a resident of Lowertown for over 38 years. She is the daughter of the late Wolf and Kale Lakin Badovsky, proprietors of W. Badovsky Meat Market located in the Byward Market. It was in her parents' store and subsequently in fruit stores such as Drazen's, Zaretsky, Schulman, Swedco, and Coopersmith that she obtained her first working experiences. Sylvia joined the civil service in 1942 at the Dominion Bureau of Statistics on Sussex Street, then at the Royal Canadian Air Force Headquarters, and later at the National Film Board. During that time, she was active in the Ottawa Civil Service Recreational Association, today known as RA, the RA Center. She was the RA radio reporter on radio station CKCO. She played the character Helen on the Alfie and Andy and Santa Claus radio show. She was an active participant in war entertainment shows for the RA and Royal Canadian Legion, and theater productions with the Royal Canadian Air Force and Jewish theater groups. Her last recording was as part of the bus tour that we enjoyed, the Lowertown bus tour, where her voice was recorded. Sylvia married Harry Kershman of blessed memory at Marsi Kehadas Synagogue in 1948, and they were blessed with two sons, Stanley and John. Together, Harry and Sylvia opened a dry cleaning plant, Bonnie Cleaners Limited, which they operated for many years. Please welcome Sylvia Kershman.
I always knew there was a way to get up in the world, especially on top of the footstool. I want to thank all of you for the interest you show and for coming out to hear about our Jewish roots in Lowertown. But before I continue, there are two people who have to be recognized. They've made long and monumental contributions to recapturing and preserving this living history. Lawrence Friedman, you deserve a Medal of Honor. You've persevered through ill health, and we all wish you continuing good health. You've also persevered through the naysayers who thought a bus stop or a bus trip through Lowertown with a pipe dream. Last summer, you made that dream come true. Not one, not two, but 3 busloads turned out, and we were turned on to the history of where our Jewish families began their life in the new land when they came to Ottawa. Shirley Berman, I don't see her here tonight. She also deserves a medal. She had the foresight to want to preserve the record of the Ottawa Jewish community, and for 30 years, long before anybody thought this was important information, she gathered it for posterity. She continues to be a staunch supporter of the Historical Society and the archives, and always pitches in whenever the emergency arises. I don't have the medals, but ladies and gentlemen, again, I would like you to recognize Shirley and Lawrence with your applause. Now, most speakers begin their talk with a joke, and I want to tell you a Jewish joke. There were 3 ladies sitting around playing casino. And the First Lady says, well, you know, girls, I've known all of you for a long time, and there's something I want to get off my chest. I'm a kleptomaniac. But don't worry, I've never stolen anything from any of you, and I never will. We've been friends too long. One of the other ladies says, well, since we're having true confessions, I'm a nymphomaniac. But don't worry, I've never approached any of your husbands and never will. We also have been friends too long. So the third lady says, well, I have a confession to make. I'm a yenta, so please excuse me, I have a lot of phone calls to make. Now, as you know, I was born in Lowertown at 321 St. Andrew Street in the mid-1920s. St. Andrew is parallel to and one block below St. Patrick. My father and mother bought the house in 1920 from Mr. Bordelot, and I lived there until 64. My parents of blessed memory, Kayla and Velia Badovsky, lived there until 71. We were 3 girls. I had 2 older sisters, Annie and then Goldie Riva. You're wondering, or I always did, what would make people of means in Russia leave their families there and travel halfway across the world to come to Canada? My father came in either late 1913 or 14, and I haven't yet been able to confirm the date. My mother arrived during the First World War in March of 1918. Well, pogroms were not something they read about in books. They lived through them. Also, in Russia, Jewish young men were conscripted into the Russian army. Death at an early age was a very distinct possibility. And if you were lucky enough to have a brother-in-law who would sponsor you and who had established himself in the community in a commercial way as the kosher butcher, and who might be able to give you a job or help you get a start, then that's where you went. In 1908, Uncle Lipa Lakin left Novozhivkov in the province of Chernigiv in Russia and came to Canada. He had been called up by the Russian army, but his family encouraged him to leave. How or why he came to Ottawa, I don't know at this moment in time, but it's something I plan to research. From records in the City of Ottawa directories, I know he lived at Reverend Doctor's at 13 Friel, then at Horowitz the jeweler at 152 Nelson. In 1912, he bought the house at 166 Friel. By this time, he became the kosher butcher in the city at 1012 Byward Market. Another butcher who was Jewish was Mitchell Goldfield. His store was right next door, also on the Byward Market. I don't know if he was a kosher butcher. In 1911, another uncle, Yosha Lakin, came to Ottawa to join Lipa. He also lived at 166 Friel. Their brother-in-law, my father, came, as I told you, in either 13 or 14. In May of 1914, Uncle Yosha, who had come, was killed in a horse and buggy accident. So I never knew him, but I knew Uncle Lipa. In Canada, names changed. Lipa at first became Levy. The Lakins were Kayonim of the priestly tribe, but in the city directory, it listed his first name as Levy. Later, he became Louis. So later, everyone knew him as Louis Lakin. My father's name also went through several changes. Velia became Wolf, the English translation of the Hebrew word Zeb. Then it became William, and even sometimes he was called Kaiser Bill. He was called that because he was tall and handsome, wore a bowler hat and spats, carried a cane when he didn't need one, and waxed the ends of his mustache, just like the Kaiser of Germany. The Lakin family had been in the meat business in Russia, selling meat wholesale, retail, both treif and kosher. They also dealt in buying and selling animal hides, buying live cattle from farmers for immediate or future delivery. At first, my father worked for my uncle, and then he branched out into buying the cattle from the farmers in the area around Ottawa. He reaped sufficient rewards that he could make the sponsorship papers for and had the money to bring his wife Kayla and his child Annie to come. World War I was raging in Europe, so the only route open to come to America was by way of the Pacific Ocean. On one of the display areas, there's a map showing the Far East and Russia. The highlighter tracing shows that they went from Kiev, where they could catch the train, for a 2-week ride on the Trans-Siberian Railway through places like Irkutsk and Birobidzhan to Vladivostok. In Vladivostok, the U.S. consular office stamped her passport saying she was bound for the United States. They then continued by rail to Harbin in Manchuria, China. In Harbin, relatives and other expatriates from Novosibirsk welcomed them for a few days' rest, and then they continued by rail to Shanghai. They boarded a boat in Shanghai to Yokohama, Japan, landed there December 18, 1917. In Japan, my mother and sister were placed in quarantine for several months because of chickenpox. And during that time, they ran out of money. My father was frantic. He hadn't heard from them. A kind Japanese man lent them some funds so my mother could wire and tell my father where they were. He sent the money. She was able to repay her benefactor, and they could now continue their journey. They left Kobe in Japan on the Atsutamara, February 28, 1918. It took 3 weeks to cross the Pacific. They cleared immigration in Seattle and then continued on to Vancouver. From there, they boarded the train, the Trans-Canada train, bound for Ottawa. In Regina, when my mother got off the train to get some food, somebody on the platform started to shout, "Kayla, Kayla!" Can you imagine how truth is stranger than fiction? The man calling out her name was Bushakin from her hometown in Novosibirsk. Altogether, it took them 6 months to come from Russia to Canada. At first, the family lived with Reverend Doctor on Rideau, and then with the Sedinskis at 19 Rose. They moved to a house at 340 Clarence. In 1920, they bought the house at 321 St. Andrew. I'd like to tell you a little more about that house. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you not. It was a large house with large rooms. The ground floor had an entrance hall, 2 front rooms on the right called a double parlor. Further along the hall, a dining room and a large kitchen. Upstairs, there were 6 bedrooms and another large room containing the sink and bathtub at the far end of the house over the kitchen. The toilet was in its own separate cubicle closer to the bedrooms. There were 2 staircases, one leading from the front entrance hall, the other from the dining room. The carved banister in the front hall was smooth and polished, and it was a fun time sliding down that banister. All the kids loved it. 2 stuffed mounted deer heads with lifelike glass eyes hung on each side of the entrance hall, welcoming you if you were old enough, or scaring you if you were too young. In the double parlor, we had a piano. My oldest sister, Annie, played the piano and was a lovely singer. The piano was also a player piano that played the rolls when you pumped the pedals. So, if you weren't old enough or tall enough to reach the keys, you could pump the pedals and still make music. We listened to a Philco radio an RCA Victor gramophone with records of famous cantors like Koussevitzky and popular music, too. The cellar was an earth cellar, but over time it was excavated and concrete poured. The supporting beams for the house were actual trees, 16 inches in circumference, without the bark removed. The foundation walls were 18 inches thick. Central heating was oil-fired until the beginning of the Second World War. The large kitchen had 2 stoves. One was a wood stove that provided extra warmth when the furnace wasn't going, and the other was a gas stove used in the months when we didn't want to burn wood for cooking. There was a large kitchen table that could seat 8, and then we come to that famous black leather lunch. Everyone called it a lunch, not a lounge. Pop used to take an afternoon nap on it. We all played, read, and enjoyed the smells of cooking and baking on it. It was close to the wood stove, and oh, so comfortable. And since we had a large home, and since there were so many Jewish immigrants and family members arriving to settle in Canada, our home was often one of the designated places to stay. My mother didn't think this was unusual. She just continued to do what she always had done in her household. After all, there are no hotels in small villages in Russia, and observant Jews stayed where they could eat as well. My sisters and I each had our own bedroom. We were happy to share our quarters with visitors at any time. We thought nothing of taking down the double-filled down mattress called a perina off the bed and make our bed on the floor of the double parlor. And my mother loved to cook. She never thought of cooking food just for us. She always made more so there'd be food for others as well. In 1921, my father rented the store at 13 Byward Market and opened W. Badofsky Meats, wholesale and retail. The store was in the old market building. That building was owned by the City of Ottawa and was demolished, I think, in the 70s in order to build the parking garage, which today fronts on Clarence and exits on William. There were other butcher shops in the building, like J.J. Slattery and O. Leclerc. On the other side of the building, facing Slover's department store, we had the place where the ladies could bring the live chickens to the shaykhut, usually on Thursdays, and then have them killed kosher. Soon afterwards, probably about 22 or 23, my father built a cooler and freezer behind our home at 321. He did this since there was no refrigeration facility in the store for storing meat. There was a small room where you could put large blocks of ice to keep the area cool, but it wouldn't keep the meats fresh or cold enough for longer periods of time. Sometimes he'd have a large shipment of meat to sell, so the cooler he built was approximately 20 by 25 and the freezer 8 by 16. Other meat merchants from the market also used these facilities when they needed to store stock. In the days before refrigerators in the home, it was a great treat on a hot summer day to take cold, fresh cherries or peaches or sliced watermelon that was ice cold. So different. So you can see the yard behind the house had lots of activity with people coming and going. We lived on the north side of St. Andrew facing McGee. The Barrett family, Mr. and Mrs. J. Barrett, Mary, Flo, Joe, Alec, Tilly, and later Gertie and Jack, they lived at 301 St. Andrew at the corner of Rose. Yankel and I played tennis against the barn on Rose Street, where they housed the horse and wagon Mr. Barrett needed for his peddling business. Beside them, before they moved to York Street, was the Paulin family, Dave, Annie, Hyman, Sheila, Alec, Chuck, and Jerry. Directly across the road from the Barretts was Sam Mora, the painter, Mrs. Mora with Jenny and Lily, who's now Mrs. Fay. Beside them were the Penny Applebaums with Dorothy and Ethel. Upstairs on the second floor lived Mrs. Goldsmith with Millie and Nancy. Millie was a classmate of mine and a very good friend. She married Ted Wolfe, and Nancy married Herb Zaslav of the Zaslav twins. I'm sorry. My apologies. I have it wrong. Further up St. Andrew, going toward King Edward, were the Schechter family, and across the road, Rose Cardish, now Taylor, lived for a short time. At the corner of King Edward and St. Andrew, Mr. and Mrs. Beckman, with their family's sons Sam, Hi, and Rose, had a confectionery store, and they lived behind the store. They carried some groceries, candies, and newspapers. We bought the latest edition of the New York Sunday News and Sunday Mirror every week. These newspapers had colored comics. One of our treats for Shabbos was to have these newspapers to read on Friday night after supper. So we always saw the Beckman family on Friday. Going east from our house on St. Andrew, at 350, I recall a number of Jewish families. The Blatchers, the Jack Landos with Sylvia and Izzy. Sid and Lena Schechter lived there with Mel and Estelle. On St. Joseph, between St. Andrew and Water, lived the Roger Greenberg family. Louie, Jenny, Gilbert, Gracie, Irving, and then Lori. Coincidentally, when the Greenbergs moved, they moved to 340 Clarence, the same house that my parents had lived in when they first came and before they bought the house. On St. Joseph, between St. Andrew and St. Patrick, lived Mary Goldfield with Anita and Rosalind. At 7 McGee lived the Honigmans, and beside them their their daughter and son-in-law, the Brzozowskis, the Grafmans, the Slanimskis, the Leafs, and later the Rudmans and the Halperns. At the corner of McGee and St. Patrick, the Levittons had their grocery store. They had 3 sons, Harry, Joe, and Nat. The Levittons sold groceries in bulk, kept herring in large wooden barrels in the basement. You lifted a trap door in the floor of the store, went down the stairs, and used a large telescoping fork to pick out the herring from the barrel. They also kept Mazola oil in the basement in barrels. You had to bring your own container to get it filled. They had flour, grains, beans, and peas. And beside them on St. Patrick was the Katznelson's family's Buckingham Dairy. Here you could get fresh milk daily. The milk was brought by truck in large silver cans, and the farmers outside of Ottawa had a contract with them. You often see these cans in antique stores. They're about 3 feet high, and sometimes they're not silver anymore, but that's the color they were then. I remember seeing trucks bring this milk in Mark McSorley Farms. And later at Lisgar Collegiate, Mary McSorley was a classmate of mine. So at the Buckingham Dairy plant, they sterilized the bottles and bottled the milk. Then they would deliver to the customers, at first by horse and wagon, and later by route truck. When the Weinsteins came to Ottawa, they lived next door to the Katznelsons. They opened a butcher shop at the rear of their home. Remember, there were no rules about what commerce you could open at that time. There were no city rules about things like that. You could open a business in your home or beside your home or at the back of your home. It's not forbidden. Further along St. Patrick Street, at the corner of Rose, Max Mossian had built a large property. It had 2 stores, dwellings for the Mossian family on Rose Street, and another apartment with the entrance on St. Patrick, where the Toronto family lived. In another building, also on Rose, they had a large and, for the time, modern bakery. In the yard, there were stalls for 6 horses and wagons. Max Mossian was one of my father's dearest friends, and our families had very close connections. Often I went into the bakery and watched them making and baking the bread. The bread baking pans were joined together in 4s. They used long wooden paddles, about 6 feet long. They lifted the pans onto the paddles, balanced them very carefully, and placed them in the deep hot oven. These ovens were wood-fired. The wonderful smell that came from these ovens was a delight whenever you turned the corner at Rose and St. Patrick. One of the stores fronting on St. Patrick was run by Percy the Barber. Anybody remember Percy the Barber? And the other was connected to the Mossians' living quarters, where they sold the bread and buns. Otherwise, they delivered to the homes. All you had to do was let them know you wanted home delivery. They put their selection in large baskets and came to your door and let you choose the bread you wanted to take. Continuing on Rose toward St. Andrew, for a very short time, Harry and Bertha Pleat ran a small post office. Going east on St. Patrick, from Friel to Chapel, on the north side lived the Shulmans, the grandparents of Stephen, Barry, and Nadine. At St. Patrick and St. Joseph, the Pedigorskis had a shoemaker shop. Those are Ben and Molly's parents. On the south side, Mr. Zaslav had his kosher butcher shop, and that was Betty Ballin's father. Louis Smith had a shoemaker shop. He was the father of the well-known numerous members of the Smith family. The Tanners had a fruit and grocery store next door to the Smiths. The Bodnoff family had a bakery and lived next door. The Finkelsteins and the Murrays, and a little later the Penny Cardishes, were on St. Patrick. And then we come to the apartment building at 8 Chapel, where the following families lived: S. Zaslav, I. Pleat, S. Lazarus, R. Markovich, Z. Goldmaker, and S. Eisenberg. I've taken you only on a short tour of 2 or 3 small blocks, but you can see how our world had most of the necessities that we required. The butcher, the baker, the corner store, all Jewish entrepreneurs, most of them serving a Jewish clientele. So wherever you went, you felt very, very comfortable and you felt safe and trusted. All these families sent their children to York Street School, and that school was built in the early 20s. It was an intermediate school, went from kindergarten to grade 8. Primary schools like Osgood, well, I know it was called some, but they changed it when I was there. So I have to go with the times. That's true. I started out in grade 7, then they called it grade 8. Because high school became grade 9. At Osgood Street School or New Edinburgh only went up to grade 6 or 5, however you work it. Then those pupils had to go to the intermediate school and finish the other 2 grades before they could go to high school. So there was an influx of other students, many of them from areas not close to our exact York Street School. We became acquainted with kids from Rockcliffe, New Edinburgh, Sandy Hill. Now that school had 3 entrances, one on Chapel, one on Friel, and one on York. The one on Friel was the boys' side. The one on Chapel was the girls' side. And the one on York was for the teachers only. When I started, Mr. Putman was the principal. When he became superintendent of the Ottawa Public Schools, Mr. Westwater took his place. Some teachers' names that might be familiar are Miss Cohen, Miss Levitin, Miss Erdley, Miss Watts, Mr. Ketchison, Mr. Matthews, Mr. Mark, and Miss McGiffin. Boys took classes in all boys' groups. Girls were all by themselves in all girls' groups. But we took part in plays, concerts, and choirs, and there was a very large schoolyard for softball, Danish rounders, and tag. In the early 1930s, going to high school was not everyone's right. During the Depression, many families suffered a great deal, and young people had to forego the dream of more education in order to help support the family. Only later did Ontario pass laws that stated that children had to attend until they were 16. With written request and a full examination of the parental situation, pupils could be given an exit school certificate at 15. The curriculum at York included many courses that are not part of the school system today. Aside from the usual subjects like English composition and literature, arithmetic, spelling, and grammar, we took classes in music, singing, gymnastics, rhythm, art, pottery, and additionally for the girls, sewing and cooking, and for the boys, manual training in wood and metals. Teachers were usually in their mid-20s, and as I mentioned previously, we had two teachers who were Jewish, Miss Levitin and Miss Cohen. On one of the tables, there's a long list of some of the girls I remember at classes at York. Please enrich our records, doesn't have to be girls, and add your name if you went to York, because there's a place for it. I'll just mention a few names like Annie Baker, Irene Levine, Bessie Batovsky, Mildred Skulski, Mildred Goldsmith, Mildred Viner, Bessie Fireman, Goldie Guinness, and Gladys Greenberg. After hours at York Street School, the girls had brownies and the 13th Girl Guide Company. The boys had Cubs and the 39th Boy Scout, all with Jewish kids, and most of the leaders were Jewish as well. I remember Mrs. Vivian, Thelma Rivers, Lillian Edelson, and Vivian Edelson as leaders. Later, my sister Goldie Riva received her warrant as a Girl Guide leader. When pupils were ready to continue to high school, there were 3 high schools. 2 classical, Lisgar, for pupils living on the east side of Bank, Glebe, for those living on the west side of Bank, and the High School of Commerce, which was in the same building as Glebe, which had courses for pupils who wanted to concentrate on bookkeeping, shorthand, and typing. My sister was at Lisgar already, so that's where I went. Girlfriends and classmates included Lila Pleat, Bess Leviton, Myra Rill, Jean Soloway, Dorothy Polisky. Some of the other York classmates who went to Commerce were Nellie Gunner, Ann Gorin, Bessie Batovsky, Irene Levine, and Mildred Skulski. Now, the large gray stone building on Lisgar began its life in 1843. It evolved from being a grammar school, a model school, and then later became a collegiate institute, which prepared pupils for university. All the teachers had to be university graduates. Originally, it wasn't a co-ed school, but when I went there, it was. And that was part of the fun, looking at all those gorgeous boys every day, having some of them in our class, walking by them in the halls as we changed classes, and admiring their athletic abilities. Wow. At Lisgar, gymnastics was a compulsory subject. Everyone learned to play basketball, volleyball, baseball. We had tennis courts across the street, a cinder track on the pathway beside the canal, and Joe Leggett, a student who attended from 35 to 41 and who returned in 60 to be a phys ed teacher, wrote the following in a book about the history of Lisgar. And I quote, "Learning ability is enhanced by regular physical activity, where once 2 periods a week were considered all that could be spared from the academic schedule. Now it is normal to have physical education scheduled for 1 period a day." End of quote. Beside the school was Cartier Square, an open area that stretched all the way from the Lisgar building to the Teachers College at Elgin, and then along Laurier to the Army Drill Hall. The boys played football and hockey, and today the City Hall of Ottawa and the Ontario Courthouse building stand on that land. The compulsory curriculum covered English composition, literature, history, mathematics, sciences, and Latin. Optional language choices were French, German, Spanish, and Greek. Every morning, every class would gather in the auditorium in its assigned section with the homeroom teacher. The student orchestra would play several selections. The principal would read passages from the Old Testament, make announcements of coming events, and then we would all sing. Assembly ended with the Lisger song, My Career. I wonder how many of us realized at that time what a subliminal, uplifting experience we had every day. Are you wondering how I got from St. Andrew to Lisger? Rain or shine, in spring, summer, fall, and winter, I walked 4 times a day. I wasn't the only one. Everybody did it. And why 4 times? Well, I went home for lunch, as many of the students did. It took 20 minutes to walk home, 20 minutes to eat a good lunch, 20 minutes to walk back. We were dismissed at 12 and started classes at 1:10, so we still had 10 minutes of leeway. I will admit I did have a student punch card for the streetcar in case of emergency, but most of the time everyone walked everywhere. In '39, World War II became a reality in our life at Lisger. The Cadet Corps, with its bugle band marching up and down the driveway, was practicing in earnest. On the forbidden 4th floor, the Royal Officers Training Corps had a shooting range. I remember learning to use a rifle there and doing target practice. That was the first time I'd ever held a gun, but I really was a good shot. Each year that went by, more of the students left to volunteer for service. Some of our Lowertown boys went and never came back. I especially remember Max Guinness and Joe Bodnoff, of blessed memory, who did not return. Joe and Nat Levitton, Max Gunner, Joe Bodnoff, Harry Applebaum, Joe Shulman, Rudy Mossian, Yor Monson, Dave Edelson, Norman Levine, Izzy Cardish, Irving Aaron, all joined up, and most of those went overseas. I could go on, but there are too many names to rhyme off. With the shortage of manpower in Canada, students were encouraged to leave school early. Some were given pass credits to leave before the end of June exams, and early in '42, on a lark, I tried civil service exams. The consensus was it would be a good thing to do, even just for the experience. In those days, a government job was considered to be a very good one. The hours were regular, the pay was better than private industry, and the annual leave and sick leaves allowed were most generous. Hundreds of girls from the high schools wrote the exam. The Civil Service Commission was hiring everyone who could qualify. Yes, I passed and I got hired for a summer job. The Unemployment Insurance Commission was formed in '42. Everyone in Canada had to be registered. Students were hired to code by hand all the categories on the registration card and transfer the data to punch cards. The punch cards were then fed into a most primitive of computers and reports prepared from the data. This all took place at the old Bureau of Statistics building on Sussex, close to the present French Embassy. We worked shifts in rotation. Week 1 was 7 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Week 2, 3 in the afternoon to 11 at night. Week 3 was 11 at night to 7 in the morning. While I was working at the Bureau, I received a call from the Civil Service offering me another position as a civilian with the RCAF at headquarters in the Jackson building. And I was offered a promotion as well. So I started to work for the RCAF in August of '42. In that same year, the Civil Service Recreational Association put on a variety show. I was one of the 6 dancers. I'd learned to tap dance at the Joe Leaf Studios on Rideau Street. The director was approached by the Knights of Columbus and Royal Canadian Legion. They wanted to create a show for the purpose of entertaining servicemen stationed within a 125-mile radius of Ottawa. And that's how Capital Capers was born. The 2 service organizations funded the expenses, and we did this on weekends. We kept our regular day job. We went to bases close by like Rockcliffe, Pendleton, Uplands, Lansdowne, Vimy and Barry were both near Kingston, and then we went to Petawawa and Iron Pryor. Sometimes we stayed for weekends, overnight, and gave shows on Saturday and Sunday. We had a number of soloists like Mona Harrison and Margaret Munson, a stand-up comic, and a good script. The dance numbers were Russian dance, a sailor's dance, and parasol dance. We were properly chaperoned. Nobody tried to test the boundaries. After the performances, we were guests in the mess halls. We were there doing our bit for the war effort, and it was a great fun. I enjoyed every minute of it. 2 other members of our community were in the show, 3 actually. I met another one today. Ralph Fonberg and Sylvia, and would you identify yourself? Oh, there you are. Francis Markson? Yes. The RA ran many interesting programs. One of these was a course in radio work. The instructor was Claude Parker, who was known well in radio circles as the creator of the Santa Claus and Alfie and Andy show. That was held at Dr. Geldert's studio on Somerset Street. The show started mid-November and continued until Christmas Eve. There were no written scripts, but the program received lots of letters from children with their wish list and their promises of hot chocolate and cookies for Santa Claus when he came. For 4 years, I had the opportunity of playing one of the child characters, Helen, on the show. As a result of that radio course, I became the RA radio reporter on CKCO. RA had many clubs like the Camera Club, the Chess Club, stamp collectors, and sports activities. These all had interesting people to interview. And recently, when I moved, I found about 100 scripts I'd written for the radio program. Forgotten all about them. In May 45, VE Day was declared. It was happy time, and I was at work at that moment. Everyone was so relieved. We made our own confetti parade on Bank Street, throwing every piece of paper we could lay our hands out the window. Oh, we had a wonderful time, and that was quite a celebration. But with the end of the war came the new reality. Now there was no need for most of the personnel in the civil service. Wholesale layoffs were the order of the day. Those of us who were hired knew that we were in the temporary category. That meant we could be let go at any time without continuing benefits or notice. And so now, for the first and only time, I was out of a job, and I became the recipient of those unemployment insurance benefits. I decided to give myself 6 months to see if I could make a career in radio, but nothing gelled. Some people in the field suggested a move to Toronto, where the opportunities were greater, but this didn't appeal to me. So with my newly minted Willis Business College certificate, I joined the National Film Board. By 46, all the men were being discharged from the services. And in the fall of 46, a new Jewish social club for young people called the Ottawa Hebrew Senior Association was formed. You're wondering, why would we have an Ottawa Hebrew Senior Association? Well, the rationale was to show that this club was of a different age group than the junior B'nai B'rith. The opening meeting attracted 70 young people. The Jewish boys who were discharged wanted to meet Jewish girls, and the Jewish girls wanted to meet Jewish boys. Harry Kershman, Ernie Wasserman, B. Applebaum, and Vera Landman spearheaded the organizing committee, and that group functioned for almost 3 years. There was something going on every weekend. We had hay rides, sleigh rides, bowling parties, hikes in the Gatineau, every conceivable kind of dance, like a Sadie Hawkins dance where the girls invited the boys, and we even had a matzah ball to celebrate the end of Pesach. What a blast. At dances, girls felt very special when their escort brought a corsage for them to wear. But the Ottawa Hebrew Senior Association was a victim of its own success. This is where almost 30 couples found their life partners. And that's where I met Harry Kershman of blessed memory, my dear life partner. Are you wondering who some of the others were? Well, there was Sylvia Dabrowski and Max Markovich, Sally Gorin and Max Toller, Vera Landman and Phil Novikov, Francis Waldman and Alan Perlman, Doris Greenberg and William Dover, Sarah Zaretsky and Lou Sadoff, Joyce Litwin and Jack Steinberg, Ethel Schinder and Manny Lightstone, Irene Levine and Hy Waxman, Betty Batovsky and Eli Prashker, Shirley Bordelais and Izzy Kardish. More members' names can be found on a table at the back showing the treasurer's log. See if you can find others who paired off with this club. We held our gatherings at the old Talmatora building on George, our first multi-purpose community center. It was on the north side of George, in the block between Dalhousie and Cumberland, and the property stretched from George to York, closer to the corner of Cumberland. In today's picture, it would be where the Salvation Army store is on George. On the ground floor, there were 4 classrooms used for school, after-school Talmatoras classes, and on the second level, there was a large hall with a stage. It was on that stage that a delightful 5-year-old Beatrice Katz kept winning the B'nai B'rith Talent Nights. And then at the back of the hall, there was a small kitchen used for preparing refreshments. Youth groups like Young Judea, B'nai B'rith held meetings in the classrooms downstairs on Sundays. The community fundraising meetings, wedding receptions, amateur nights, and dances were usually held in the upstairs hall. The Ottawa Hebrew Senior Association found that as the couples married and moved away, there was no one to take over the leadership, and so it petered out in 1948. Harry and I married in July 4, 1948 at Mahsiki. Our family's relationship goes back to the 30s. My father was a member of Rideau Street Shul, but for some reason he changed to Mahsiki, and I've been connected with it ever since. Through marriage to Harry, through sisterhood, through the bar mitzvahs of Stanley and John, through the marriages of Stanley to Carol, of John to Sabina, through the bris of Zev, Benjamin, and Zachary, and in the near future, please God, the bar and bat mitzvah of Zev and Kayla. Now, Mahsiki Hadass Synagogue at the corner of Murray and King Edward was known as the peddler's shul. In the 1920s and 30s,
Sorry, just hold it. I want to change the tape.